Hello Rebels, Stephen here, outside the Science Museum in London, where scientists for Extinction Rebellion are staging a very noisy protest indeed. Let's flip the camera and see what's going on. So I'm here outside the Science Museum in London, where scientists for Extinction Rebellion are taking action. Listen to the science, they chant. The science is clear. That's what we're saying. That's what Greta's saying. Listen to the science. You can argue in politics. You can't argue with physics.
Crisis! Climate! Crisis! Listen to the science!
Listen to the science!
The science is clear!
The science is clear!
Tell me, can't you see it?
Tell me, can't you see it? The emergency is here! Climate! Crisis!
Extinction!
Rebellion!
Extinction!
Rebellion!
Extinction!
Rebellion!
Extinction!
Rebellion!
Listen to the science!
Listen to the science!
The science is clear!
The science is clear!
Tell me, can't you see it?
Tell me, can't you see it?
The emergency is here!
The emergency is here!
Climate!
Climate!
Crisis!
Crisis!
Climate!
Climate!
Crisis!
Crisis!
Climate!
Climate!
Justice!
Justice!
Climate!
Climate!
Justice!
Justice!
And when do we want it?
Now!
Good afternoon, everyone! Whoa, there's echo on that. Can we get the echo turned down, please, Leo? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for disturbing your Saturday afternoon as you're going into the Science Museum here today. We are a group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. We here represent... I'm Dr. Emily Grossman, and we here as a group represent over 350 top-level senior researchers and scientists across the globe who have now signed our declaration in support of non-violent direct action. The work that's going on the streets today and all of this week through Extinction Rebellion to bring attention to the climate and ecological emergency and to say that we have no choice left now but to take non-violent direct action against government's inaction against the climate and ecological emergency. Our declaration, which I'm about to read to you, has been signed already just in some few short weeks by over 350 top researchers, academics and professors from across the world, at least half of whom are very senior researchers in the field of climate science, of ecology, of land loss, of forestry and geology. So in a moment we're going to tell you why we're here outside the Science Museum today, other than the fact it seems an appropriate place for us to be as scientists, to bring ourselves together, members of the scientific community here behind me and those who are watching on Livestream and all over the world supporting the work that we're doing. We've been at the Rebellion all week. We've been hosting a science tent at various different sites where the scientists behind you have been answering questions from the public. They've been putting across the real truth, the scientific truth behind the climate and ecological emergency. We've been giving talks and we've been supporting the other rebels from Extinction Rebellion who've been on the streets, camped out, tirelessly and fearlessly, some of them putting themselves up for arrest in order to draw attention to what we now know 99% of climate scientists across the globe agree is a global emergency. I'd like to read to you the declaration that I mentioned that's been signed by scientists across the world. Some of our major, most senior professors of climate science have added their names to this declaration, some of whom are standing behind you today. I want to draw attention, well, there's a lot of amazing people here, but Dr. Charlie Gardner, who's done a lot of work in the press this week, speaking out about the need for scientists to take direct action. Charlie, can you just give us one sentence what your specialism is, what your field is?
I work to preserve the natural world. So all over the world we are losing ecosystems and species at unprecedented rates. We need these ecosystems for our survival, and we are undermining our own survival, and I work against that.
I'd also like to introduce, again before I read the declaration, stay tuned for that, I'd like to introduce another key player in the bid to really inform the world about the action that needs to be taken, and that's Professor Julia Steinberger, who we've got along here, I believe. Where's she gone? She was behind me a minute ago. Ah, she moved. Julia, can you come over here and just introduce yourself, please, just for a moment? Just the top line. Who are you and what do you do?
My name's Julia Steinberger. I'm a professor at the University of Leeds. I'm also a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, although I do not speak for them today. They speak for themselves through their reports. And I'm very proud to be with the scientists for Extinction Rebellion. I think that this is what we need to do for the climate to be taken seriously.
I'd also like to introduce Sven here. Sven, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Sven and I'm doing adaptation work for climate change in Cambodia. It's a desert out there and climate change effects are felt very, very different over there already.
I'd like to also just finally introduce, so there's a lot of amazing people here, but I'd like to introduce Dr. Aaron Thierry, who's over there, who's been giving out some flyers. Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure, so I worked as an ecologist up in the Arctic, and I was studying the effects that climate change is having up there. And what I saw up there really terrified me because it's so dramatic, the changes in the environment up there. The Arctic's warming about twice as fast as the rest of the world at the moment, but what the changes that we're seeing up there and the rapidity of that change, that's going to be seen here as well in just a few years. So we really have to take action now if we're to avoid really, really terrible consequences.
Thank you, Aaron. And just to clarify, the thing that actually has tripped us up for the last 40 years, which you're seeing play out right now, is that scientists are notoriously shy. There's very few people standing behind me who are actually wanting to stand up and actually tell you who they are. I can absolutely attest to the fact that we've got some of the top climate scientists across the world standing here today, but they're all saying, oh, you know, I'm not sure. This is a big deal for climate scientists to come out on a Saturday afternoon, to hold banners and placards and actually make a noise. This isn't what we're trained to do, and that's why this is not tend to be listened to, because scientists have been speaking truth for 40 years. 40 years they've been warning the world that this was about to happen, and now it's happening. And because it's now happening, we're all forced to actually come out and talk about it in a way that at times goes beyond the bounds of the law. So to back that up, I'd like to read you this declaration I've been talking about. For those who've just joined us, this declaration has been drafted by this community of climate scientists, ecologists and other scientists across the globe who are standing now for taking action to support the climate and ecological emergency, to support the governments to tell the truth about climate change and the ecological crisis, to support the need to move our net zero commitment forward to 2025 for various reasons, which you can read about if you read the emergency page of the Extinction Rebellion document website that's been verified by climate scientists. And we're also standing for the need for the government to call a citizens' assembly to decide how on earth we're going to move forwards with this crisis. But the fact is we have to move forwards and we have to do something. So this declaration has been signed, as I've said a few times, by over 350 top-level researchers across the globe, over half of whom work directly in the fields of climate science and biodiversity. Our declaration is as such. As scientists, we have dedicated our lives to the study and understanding of our world and our place in it. We declare that scientific evidence shows, beyond all reasonable doubt, that human-caused changes to our Earth, changes to our land, our seas and our air, are severely threatening the habitability of our planet. We further declare that overwhelming evidence shows that if global greenhouse gas emissions are not brought rapidly down to net zero, if biodiversity loss is not halted, we risk damage to our planetary life support systems that is catastrophic and irreversible, causing incalculable human suffering and many deaths. We note that despite the scientific community first sounding the alarm on human-caused global warming more than 4 decades ago, No action taken by government so far has been sufficient. Global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise steeply. Biodiversity loss continues at an ever-increasing rate. We now call for immediate and decisive action by governments worldwide. We call for governments to halt greenhouse gas emissions. We call for governments to take action to prevent further biodiversity loss. And we call for governments to restore, to the fullest extent possible, the damage that has already been done. We urge governments to provide particular support to those who will be most affected by climate change and by the transition to a sustainable economy. As scientists, we have an obligation beyond merely describing and understanding the natural world. We must now take an active part in helping to protect it. We note that the scientific community has already tried all conventional methods to draw attention to this crisis. We believe that the continued governmental inaction over the climate and ecological crisis constitutes a crime against humanity. We believe that this crime now justifies non-violent direct action, which goes beyond the bounds of the law. We are therefore actively supporting those who are rising up peacefully against governments that are failing to act proportionately to the scale of this crisis. We believe it is our moral duty to act now, and we urge other scientists to join us to protect humanity's only home. Now in a moment you're going to hear about why we've chosen here, particularly outside the Science Museum, to be here today. You may be aware that there are marches and protests and demonstrations taking place across other parts of central London today. We've chosen to come out here in the rain to stand in front of you outside the Science Museum for a few reasons. Firstly, the Science Museum really does, we hope, represent us as scientists. It's a hugely important institution in our country. It's also a home for families. It's where families come to learn about science, to learn to be the scientists of the future. No, that's okay, I'm fine. Thank you, no. So we've chosen to come here today, and I'm going to call on Leo, one of our other founders of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, to explain to you specifically why else we've chosen the Science Museum. But just to say, before I hand over to Leo, that if you're interested in the work that we're doing, please follow us on Facebook. We're called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. Please follow us on Twitter, @ScientistsX. Not ScientistsXR, which is actually what we're called, but the Twitter handle is @ScientistsX. Please follow us, please retweet us, please follow what's going on our Facebook page. Please, if you're filming, please get it onto social media. Please live stream, please post the links, put it on your Facebook, tag us in. Please, let's get the word out there that 99% of climate scientists across the world are now confirming that we are in a climate and ecological emergency. It is crisis time. We have 8.5 years before we've finished using up all of the carbon budget that we have left allotted to us before we go over the 1.5 degrees warming which we've committed to by the Paris Agreement. We've committed to reducing our warming, to reducing our global greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. However, one, this is too late. That's not going to get us out of this mess. And two, it's not happening anyway. An intergovernment, a committee within the government's own advisors went in July after they declared a climate emergency, paid lip service to the work we're trying to do here. After they declared it, the government's own committee went in and declared that the government were only meeting 7 out of the 24 goals that they themselves had put in place in order to reduce emissions. In the last 5 years, the UK has released more fossil fuels invested more subsidies in fossil fuel companies than any other country in the EU. In the last 5 years, we've invested around £10 billion in fossil fuel subsidies. We're constantly being told that fossil fuel emissions are coming down in the UK. Well, that may be so, but that's because we are investing in fossil fuel companies abroad, mostly in low to middle income countries. It's also because we are increasingly shipping in our produce from abroad. We're letting everybody else take the blame for our fossil fuel emissions. Not to mention the fact that actually we are the most responsible historically anyway. We started the Industrial Revolution. We've been pioneers in science innovation. We've been pumping out carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at crazy levels since 1850, the Industrial Revolution. Carbon dioxide levels are now higher than they've been in over 3 million years. Yes, the world's been hotter before. Yes, we've had carbon dioxide levels higher before, but certainly not since 3 million years ago. And never, categorically never, this rate of increase, this speed of increase. Last time we had super hot temperatures, 250 million years ago, not the last time, but one of the times. That was the Great Die-In, where we lost 97% of life on this planet. We are losing potentially it's been stated that we are going to be losing 1 million species in the next 10 years. We are being, as you can see, we are having more and more extreme weather, flooding, heat waves across the globe. We depend on 50% of our food imports from other countries, 70 to 80% of our fruit and vegetables. We're going to be seeing more and more heat waves, more and more droughts, more and more monsoons and typhoons that are going to be knocking out the agriculture, the foods, the crops from countries across the world that we rely on to feed ourselves and to feed our children. And it's going to get worse. Climate scientists are saying that we're heading towards a 4 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century unless we do something right now. 4 degrees, some scientists, some top climate scientists have acknowledged that at 4 degrees C, they find it difficult to imagine how this planet could sustain more than 1 billion people. By that point in time, our population could be up to 9 billion. What's going to happen to the rest of us? We're talking about societal collapse, lack of food, lack of clean water, civil unrest, possibly world wars. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has actually said that by the time we get to financial instability, it will be too late. This is being declared by people at the UN, by people across the world, by the Pope, by the Archbishop of Canterbury, by rabbis, by Muslim leaders. We are being told that this is an emergency. We have to act now. We can't wait till 2050. We have to act immediately. We're already running out of time. So, I'm going to invite Leo to tell you why specifically we're here at the Science Museum today. Leo, could you introduce yourself and tell us why you're here?
Hello, my name's Leo, Leo Green. I'm a mechanical engineer. I've only got a master's, so I feel like a bit of an idiot like these people. We're here today because we just want to say to the Science Museum, we love you, but you're in a relationship that's not very healthy. You're in a relationship with BP and with Shell and with other oil companies, and you take their sponsorship money, and for that they get a social license. They get to say we're a good company. People think, oh cool, BP works at the Science Museum, they must be friendly. But that money's going in to help teach kids about science, at the same time as these polluting companies are actually destroying the children's future. We want children to be raised to be ecologists, not paleoecologists. We want the animals and the plants to be there when they grow up to be scientists. We want a stable society where they can really question the universe instead of just trying to fight over how they can survive. So you might think, okay, these museums, they're good, they're influencing the big polluters and they're changing them. But if you look, Shell have said that they're going to increase their oil output by 37.6% by 2030. BP has said they're going to increase it by 20.1%. There's going to be 7 million more barrels a day of oil projected by 2030 with these companies' plans. They're not adapting to the climate crisis. They're nowhere near the goals that the Paris Agreement set, nowhere near at all the 2025 goal that we need. They're just not listening at all, and they're using your relationship. They're being a bad parent to all these kids that are going to grow up to be scientists. So we're asking you, prove that your relationship is making a difference. Prove that they are going to turn around and actually save the world, because it definitely doesn't look like it right now. And if you can't prove it, you're scientists, so chuck them out. It's a bad relationship. You're not raising your children properly. And we're doing this because we love you. We love you! We love you! So, thank you very much. I think we're going to have a bit of a Q&A now with all these amazing experts that have come down to answer anyone's questions they might have. I'm going to introduce Emily and then Colin.
Great, so just to clarify, this abusive relationship we're talking about, we're not demonising the Science Museum here. There are a lot of industries across the UK and across the world that were sort of handcuffed to these fossil fuel companies. And the fossil fuel companies really are who we're targeting here. BP, Shell, the companies across the world. But organisations such as the Science Museum, which is why we're here today, but actually many other organisations. New Scientists are hosting a conference this weekend with a climate change part to their event, and it's being sponsored by BP. So we're asking for these organisations to really review their relationships with these companies, to use their influence for good, to ask these fossil fuel companies, you know, what are you actually doing to invest more in clean energy, to bring down your investment in oil, in gas. We're not asking you to chuck them out quite yet, although we'd like you to. We're asking you to use your influence for good, to show that you're in line with our scientists of the future. And we're appealing to the Science Museum to come and talk to us, to work with us, to have a conversation with you as the public about what they're planning to do to help use their influence to influence these fossil fuel companies who've been lying to us, outright lying to us for decades. Now, just before we move to the Q&A, somebody has asked me to explain the significance of these coloured stripes on our banners. Brilliant question, because these coloured stripes are actually incredibly important to the reason that we're here today. So if you're filming, if you're live streaming, just pull out a little bit so that you can actually see the stripes on these banners. Can anyone here tell me what these stripes represent, why they're significant? Yeah. Brilliant. Do you want to say that a little bit louder? Shall I put your video onto you so we can see you doing it?
Is it the temperature that's represented by those different stripes and colours and how it's going up and down and the big differences?
Brilliant, that's absolutely right. So whoever's with this young lady here, do you want to film for her? Because I'm going to ask her to come up and help me demonstrate exactly what this means. What's your name?
Emily.
Emily. Oh, I'm Emily. Nice to meet you. Cool. Okay, so which banner should we use? People who are filming, where do you want us? We use this one? The one that says Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. So Emily, if you come and join me. So what these stripes represent, as Emily's very brilliantly explained, is these represent the temperature of the Earth, global average temperatures over the last sort of 150 years. So if you give us a point down that end there, that's kind of, it's about 150 years ago, scientists? 1850. 1850, exactly. Oh, okay, so about 170 years ago. So 1850, we've got about, starting about here. So if you point your finger there, that's around 1850. So if we start moving along, you'll see that this is a sort of the colour represents the temperature. So you'll see it gets a bit colder, a little bit warmer, a little bit colder, 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 warmer, warmer, colder, colder. So you're sort of going up and down, a little bit up and down over the last 150 years. So if we carry on moving along, this is where humans started to go through the Industrial Revolution. That meant using fossil fuels. Anyone know anything about fossil fuels in terms of why they're particularly bad and why we're concerned? Yes, Emily.
Aren't they the thing that goes around the fossils and they're like what? Well, they burn the fossils basically, the dinosaurs to try and do it.
That's exactly right. So when we burn fossil fuels, we're effectively burning dead sea creatures and dead plants that have been dead for millions and millions of years. Now, do you know what actually happens when we burn the fossil fuels? Do you know what gets released?
Isn't it carbon dioxide, but I'm not sure.
Well done, Emily. It is carbon dioxide. And the thing is, the carbon dioxide levels on our planet have gone up and down over the past hundreds of millions of years, but they've gone up and down very, 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 very slowly. And that's what drives us into a warmer Earth, which takes us in and out of periods of ice age or glaciation. But at this time in history, we were expecting carbon dioxide levels, if anything, to start going down a little bit, because that's where we are in Earth's cycles. But carbon dioxide, can you tell me, Emily, can you tell me a link? Are you aware of a link between carbon dioxide levels and what we're trying to do here, which is, of course, temperature?
Doesn't the carbon dioxide make the blanket around the Earth thicker, which means that the sun comes in and can't get out, which makes it warmer?
Do you want my job? I think you should host this event. You are amazing. That is brilliantly explained. So the carbon dioxide that gets released from these fossil fuels, which shouldn't have been released these days, it's been trapped for millions of years, As it gets released, it builds up this blanket of greenhouse gases that are around the Earth. This blanket of greenhouse gases acts a bit like kind of the roof of a greenhouse, hence why they're called greenhouse gases. The sun gets in, it warms up the Earth gets warm, the heat comes off the Earth, and then it stops. It doesn't go out to space, the greenhouse gases trap it like a snuggly blanket. Now without this snuggly blanket, we'd all be dead. We need greenhouse gases. Without it, we'd be trying to sleep at night at minus 18 degrees. It would be pretty cold, not very easy to live. However, this blanket, which has gone up and down naturally for millions and millions of years, because of the fossil fuel emissions from factories, from coal, from oil, and also because of cows. Do you know what cows have got to do with this?
Yeah. I thought you might. So, basically, don't they release gases which come up and help build the blanket once they've eaten, like, the different things? And also, doesn't it relate, they chop down forests and things so that they can do this weed stuff? And this is also interesting. I watched something on it, which was every 9 kilograms of meat, wheat that we give to these animals, they only produce 1 kilogram in return. And if we stopped these animals from having that wheat, it could help 1/3 of hunger problems, or like. Literally, my work here is done. You can totally take over, Amelie. This is amazing. So yes, as Amelie's just described, that when we graze cattle, we chop down trees. Now, first of all, that stops the trees that normally absorb carbon dioxide from the snuggly blanket, putting it in, therefore these carbon dioxide levels can't be reduced. Secondly, when you burn those trees, they release even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And thirdly, as you rightly said, that leaves the land clear for grazing cattle. And cattle, like cows, produce, as you said, one of the greenhouse gases, which is called methane. Now, methane we don't hear about as much as carbon dioxide, but actually cows produce so much methane that it's having really a significant impact to greenhouse gases. In fact, a single cow, fun fact here, a single cow releases enough methane in one day from burping to fill 15 party balloons full of gas. That's one cow in one day. That's a lot. So this methane, this carbon dioxide, is adding to our fluffy blanket around the Earth, and it's making us get warmer. So as you can see, as we move on from the Industrial Revolution, nothing starts to happen quite yet, because it takes a while for these effects to build up. So we get warmer, colder, warmer, colder, warmer, colder. So Amelie, come along up here. As we get to sort of around here, this is probably around the 1900s, 1950s. As you can see, the colour's starting to get a little bit paler, a little bit more towards the red end of the spectrum. And it continues. So Amelie, if we come up here, we're now moving towards the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the year 2000. Hopefully you can see that there is suddenly hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. If we move to the last 20 years, 19 of the hottest years on record have been in the last 20 years. The last 4 years have been the hottest on record. And it's going to continue. And it's directly due to these global greenhouse gas emissions, methane, carbon dioxide, and other gases that are being pumped into the air because of the action of humans. Can we give Amelie a round of applause? I was just going to say thank you for doing this. And at school, I just wanted to mention my group of friends with me, my best friend Bethan and Annabella and Amelia, actually told me about this, so something has to go to them, and we've started this club, and we've all agreed that at some point we are going to come on a climate change vote, and we are going to do this at some point, so I wanted to give a bit of credit to them.
Thank you to Amelie's friends. What's your friend's name again?
Bethan, Kassia, Amelia, and Annabella.
Bethan, Cassia, Amelia, and Annabella, and of course Amelie here, who's with us today, who's clearly climate science communicator of the future, perhaps even a climate scientist herself, who's going to go out and change the world. And what her message to us all is also thank you. Thank you to the young people who are taking up the challenge, but thank you to us for being here, for being out on the streets, and the whole of Extinction Rebellion, for raising the profile of this issue, for getting it out, having schools learning about it, teaching about it, getting it out on the media more and more and more, and making the next generation grow up into people who are really going to help us out of this crisis. Thank you, Amelia. So I think,
as Leo said, we're going to have a bit of a Q&A. It's getting a bit wet, but if anyone wants to ask us any questions based on anything we've shared today, based on what we've shared about the climate crisis, or what we've shared about Extinction Rebellion, if you've got any questions about Extinction Rebellion, we can also answer that. And also, specifically about the relationship that we're here to talk about, which is the relationship by organisations such as the Science Museum, not just the Science Museum, who are tied to these fossil fuel companies. Are they doing enough? Could they be doing more? We think so. We're inviting them to come into conversation with us, not now, not right now, but at a future date, to really help to use their influence for good. So any questions? Leo, did you want to invite in some panel members?
Colin's running the panel.
Brilliant. Colin, wonderful. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Colin Davis. I'm a professor of psychology. And you might think, what's psychology got to do with climate change? Well, actually, quite a lot. And it relates to this. Tell the truth. Because climate scientists have been telling the truth for decades now. This is not a new story. The story hasn't really changed, has it, right? Am I right? We've been saying the same thing for 3-4 decades. But this is a difficult message for people to hear. It's a message that governments don't necessarily want to hear. It's a message that BP doesn't want to hear. But it's also a difficult message for people who are worried about changing their lifestyle. And there's something I want to say about that, and Emily talked about this before. Sometimes people think that this is all about pointing the finger. And it's really important in Extinction Rebellion that we are not about shaming and blaming. That is one of the 10 principles of Extinction Rebellion. So when we come out here on the streets and we say there's this big problem, it is not about pointing at people and saying, you need to stop doing this, this is your fault, you need to stop doing that. We are calling on the government to make changes, because it is government that has the power to make really big changes. Now, a great example of that is plastic bags. So we figured out a while ago we have this big problem with plastic bags, but we have reduced that incredibly. So we're using tens of billions fewer plastic bags than we were a few years ago. And is that because everyone woke up one day and said, oh, I'm not going to take the bag today? No, it's because the government introduced a 5-penny tax and people figured, well, you know, maybe I don't actually need the bag that much. Simple changes government can make if we put pressure on them. So that's what Extinction Rebellion is all about. So we are here to tell the truth. People of London, visitors to London, police officers, you have a wonderful opportunity here. We have lots of scientists, leading scientists. You don't need to go into the Science Museum to find out about science. You have the science here. So we want your questions. Does anyone have a question for our favorite science?
In the worst case scenario, if all the ice was to melt, how big would the sea level rise be? How much would it be?
Great question. A question about rising sea levels. Who shall I turn to for this?
Hang on, we've got a panel for this discussion. I'd like to start with Aaron and then...
Yes, so, well, let's start with Aaron for that.
So, to answer your question, if all of the ice was to melt from Greenland and both West and East Antarctica, then we were thinking that the sea level rise that we could expect is about 65 meters, which is taller than that building. Where we stand right now, we're probably close to being underwater. So that's probably not going to happen, at least not anytime soon, right? So, but we are concerned that the seas are already rising, and they're already rising because the ice sheets are already melting. And they have been for a long time. We've been able to show this, and they're melting at quicker and quicker rates. So what we're now seeing is that the projections that we thought about how high sea levels were going to rise, we probably got it too low. Sea levels are going to rise more than we thought. And so currently the expectation is that if we don't take action and we carry on burning fossil fuels, then by the end of the century we could see a metre, maybe more, of sea level rise around the world. And but the other thing is that we also can say that the seas won't stop rising at that point. They will carry on rising for a very long time afterwards. And so at the CO2 levels that we already have in the atmosphere, we could have locked in many meters of sea level rise already. And if we carry on burning fossil fuels, we will lock in even more. So it's very important to know that. But this sea level rise is really important because it affects all the coastal cities in the world. And there's hundreds of millions of people live in those cities. And so even a half a meter or less of sea level rise can really dramatically increase the rate of flooding in those cities and in those ports that are the bedrock of all the international trade of goods around the world. So this could be really disruptive. And so what we're seeing is that probably by 2050, the rate of extreme sea rise events where you get flooding from the sea will increase to roughly 1 a year in many cities around the world. Now, that's an event that would normally currently happen only once every 100 years. So we've gone from a once-in-a-century event to a once-an-annual event. And that's just by 2050. We're going to see much more disruption after that.
I'd just like to add that I saw a brilliant calculation that was done by a fantastic science communicator called Tim in Exeter, actually. And he calculated that if you add together all of the ice melting from all the different parts of the world, the Arctic, the Antarctic, the Greenland ice sheets, land sheets, the glaciers, if you add that all together and you average it out over the past 40 years, that's the equivalent of 300 double-decker buses worth of ice melting every second. That's a lot of ice. And it's only getting faster.
Thank you, Emily. Yes. It's melting very fast, and it's going to be really bad in the future, but it's pretty bad now. So people in Bangladesh, there's a village in Wales which is being decommissioned. It's going to be decommissioned by 2050 because people won't be able to live there anymore. Now, I'm going to ask our assembled panel if they can maybe move to the centre to make it easy. So we've already heard from Aaron. I'll ask you each to introduce yourself in a moment. We've heard from Aaron and Emily. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just pass. Yes. So let's just go along. So let's start with Sven. Can you tell us again a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Good afternoon. My name is Sven. I'm a former guest lecturer at the United Nations mandated University for Peace. And I've been researching at universities on 3 continents. And unfortunately over there, the impacts of climate change are very visible already. And therefore, also I came out of the ivory tower in order to protest and vocalize the messages of science.
Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Grossman. My background is I have a degree in natural sciences from Cambridge University and a PhD in molecular biology and genetics. I now work as a science communicator, so I work as a broadcaster, a writer and an educator. I appear in a lot of TV shows as a science expert. I write for lots of newspapers. I've just published my first kids book, which is called Brain Fizzing Facts, which does have a bit of climate change in it. And I'm here as one of the founders of Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, who's been bringing together scientists from across the globe and verifying all the climate science that's being put out by organisations such as Extinction Rebellion to make sure that we're really telling the truth about the climate and ecological emergency.
Thanks, Emily. My name's Aaron. I'm an ecologist by training, so I study ecosystems and all the living things that make up the world around us. In particular, I was interested in how those are being disrupted now by the changes that we're seeing driven by man's impact on the environment. So in particular, I studied the collapse of food webs. So if you think about all the different animals and plants and all the feeding interactions between them, then if you put them all together for any ecosystem, they're all interconnected together as a big fabric, a big network, and we call those food webs. And so what we're seeing now is because some of those species are being made extinct or really rare, then the interactions between those species are starting to disappear. And so that network is getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and it's starting to fall apart. So if you imagine a house of cards, and you tried to pull out the card from inside that, or a Jenga tower, and you try to take out bricks from the Jenga tower, at some point the whole tower just falls down and collapses. And so that was one of the things that I studied. And then after that, I went up and studied in the Arctic and looked at the permafrost up there and how that was being melting now because of climate change and the result of greenhouse gas emissions that results from that, and how that actually, the changes in the environment make the climate change even worse.
My name is Julia Steinberger. I'm a professor of ecological economics at the University of Leeds, and I am also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, so you might think this is a strange place for me to be, but it's actually, I believe, the right place for me to be. My research is actually on the economic side of climate change, but I wasn't trained as an economist. I was trained as a physicist, and I think we don't have the same kind of prejudices when we go into the world. And one of the things I've been wondering about is what happens if we just stopped using so much stuff? What a crazy idea. What, do we need growth forever, or maybe we just don't need to use as much stuff? So what I really study is I study the amount of energy that is necessary to lead a decent life. And you know what? It turns out it's not that much. And so one of the things that we could do really, really fast as a society, if we chose to, much faster than installing solar panels or wind turbines or new technological gadgets, is just use less stuff. But we need to decide to do it really, really fast.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlie, Dr. Charlie Gardner. My research is focused on the ecological crisis, the loss of biodiversity and the loss of functional ecosystems. We hear a lot about the climate crisis, but in fact we suffer two environmental crises, and each are as serious and as important as each other. We need biodiversity for all sorts of reasons, but very selfishly we cannot address the climate crisis without addressing the biodiversity crisis, because restoring natural ecosystems is our cheapest and easiest way of addressing the climate crisis beyond reducing fossil fuels. So if you have any questions about what's happening to our natural world, then, and Aaron can't answer them, then I will answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
As I've said before, I'd like to say again, if anyone is filming or taking photos, please do pop them on social media. Please do tag us in, because obviously we're all here, so we can't film ourselves, and we want to get these messages out there. You can follow us on the Facebook page, Scientists for Extinction Rebellion, or you can tweet us at ScientistsX. Please do tag us in any photos or any live streaming or any videos. Please do those things if you're not doing it already, because it will really help us to get our messages out there. Thank you, everyone. So the Twitter handle is at ScientistsX, Scientists Extinction Rebellion. Or on Facebook, if you want to go through Facebook, if you tag to the page Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. If you can't find either of those, just tag me at Dr. Emily Grossman. I will move it through to those relevant places, at Dr. Emily Grossman, Grossman.
Thanks, Emily. And I really want to reiterate what Charlie was just saying. Often you'll hear people talking about Extinction Rebellion and say they're climate protesters. Well, yes, we're really concerned about the climate emergency, but it's not just the climate. We have this separate emergency, which is an ecological crisis. We are living through the 6th mass extinction, or what George Monbiot has recently referred to as the first mass extermination. Basically, we are killing all of the other species around us. So, everyone walking by, I know you want to go to the Science Museum, but you have real scientists here. These people are not actors. They're not simply wearing white lab coats. They are real scientists. They are experts. They can tell you what you need to know about the ecological and climate emergency. So please, bring us your questions. Who would like to ask a question first? Yes, sir.
There's quite a lot of noise about carbon recapture in planting trees, and there's a lot of companies that are jumping on that bandwagon. Does anyone have any information about how effective that strategy would be? As well, obviously, reducing emissions in the first place is the right thing to do, but also there's already so much carbon in the atmosphere. So how effective is the conversation about carbon recapture?
So is carbon capture going to provide a nice, simple, technological fix to our problem?
I'd like to illustrate that with an example of what's happened in the past. This is based on a piece of research that came out earlier this year. So in the Middle Ages, several hundred years ago in Europe, we suffered what was called the Little Ice Age. And for a long time it's been unexplained why the temperatures it was in the 1500s, late 1500s, we had this little ice age, and for a long time it was unexplained why temperatures in Europe got so much colder at that time. They've recently found out that it was because of the depopulation of the Americas. So in 1492, Columbus arrived in North America. The conquistadors in South America caused a genocide, and people were exterminated not just by war, but by disease. So the population of South America and North America were dramatically reduced. Something like, I think 80 or 90%, I can't remember the figures. And what happened then was there was mass abandonment of land, and that land became rewilded in today's terminology. So trees grew on that land, and the trees growing in the abandoned land reduced atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations by 7 parts per million and brought the temperature of Europe down by several degrees. So that was a historical accident, not an attempt to restore wilderness in order to bring down the temperature, but it very clearly had that effect. So, that was, of course, a vast amount of land we were talking about, but the potential is certainly there.
I guess what I would just like to say about this is that depending on the trajectory, where we want to go, what amount of warming we want to build into the system, we sort of have a trade-off between emissions now and taking it back out later, including carbon capture and storage. These technologies aren't proven, except for trees, which are proven technologies. The other thing is if we have this phenomenon of what we call overshoot, where the temperature goes higher and then we try to draw it down, we're talking about irreversible species loss, irreversible damage to ecosystems, and potentially permanently harming the capacity for ecosystems to regenerate and suck the carbon out of the atmosphere as well, because you're starting to turn soil, you're starting to sort of see desertification and those kinds of things. So you're absolutely right to be a bit doubtful about it and to say that what you said is exactly right. We need to stop emissions now and maybe plant a few more trees as a side effect.
So just one other thing I think on this as well is you've got to think about who's bearing the burden of this. So every time that we're not taking action now and coming up with suggestions that in the future they'll take it out of the sky, it'll be okay, we're putting the burden on future generations. And we keep doing this, and we've been doing this for 30 years and not taking action because we said, don't worry, they'll sort it out in the future. We can't wait any longer, it's an emergency. And so, yes, there are things that we can do that will help remove CO2, but we need to be doing everything. We need to be reducing energy, we need to be switching to renewables, we need to also be planting trees and other types of CO2 capture. We have to do it all.
And just to summarise from, I'm a science communicator, I'm not the scientist doing the work, but having been sort of absorbing myself and reading all the papers and talking to all the experts on this, it seems like the bottom line is that those technologies might be possible, but we just don't know yet. And we're certainly not at any point where we can rely on it. Absolutely not. So my answer to your question would be categorically no. We cannot rely on that. It's not going to get us out of this issue. And this whole planting trees business, wasn't there some campaign recently to plant 7 million trees in the UK or something? I mean, somebody worked out that would basically sort us out for about an hour's worth of carbon dioxide emissions. I mean, it's nonsense. We need to be planting 7 billion, not 7 million, So we need grand scale reforestation. HS2, which is still being bankrolled by the UK government, has been called the largest deforestation project since World War I. I mean, we're cutting down trees, we're not helping things. We're investing in more fossil fuels, we're cutting down more trees, and we're pretending, the government are pretending, that something's happening. It's actually quite the opposite. As in something positive's happening. It's not.
Thank you. So that was carbon capture. It's not going to be a very simple fix. What's scary though is that if you look at these IPCC models about how we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees, they depend upon carbon capture. So we're putting an awful lot of eggs in that basket. Now if you're just joining us, let me tell you again, these people are real scientists, they are experts. We have people from the IPCC here. They are here to tell you all about our climate crisis and our ecological crisis. And they've come out of their labs because this is an emergency. That's why we are sitting in the streets. We have people here who've been arrested. I've been arrested twice. I was in court yesterday. We're very happy to take questions not just about science, but about climate activism. And maybe I might ask Sven to say something about, but not stand over there. Do you want to say something briefly, Sven, about why it is that scientists are becoming activists?
Absolutely, I can do that. As scientists, usually we really like to stay in our halls, in our rooms of science, where we communicate with very convoluted language in journals and mostly reserved to an audience of very exclusive people. So across history, time and space, it has not often happened that scientists actually go outside and block a road in order to carry that message outside of those rooms. However, this is one of those moments, unfortunately. We have, as societies, kind of forgotten what our heroes of peace, like Gandhi, like Dr. Luther King, like Nelson Mandela, actually did, because we have constructed a sort of imagery that fits in our narrative of that no obstruction is being made. However, those heroes of peace also had to block roads or refuse to do certain actions in order to get their goals. Mahatma Gandhi, for example, he led a salt strike, a refusal to pay a tax which caused widespread economic damage and actually led 100,000 people being imprisoned. The amount of disruption, for which we very much apologize, is quite minimal compared to what those legends of peace have done. Also in the UK, universal suffrage came to some extent out of the halls of universities and led to blocked roads and unhinged roads. It really doesn't happen often. We're actually quite a timid, silent group of people. For many of us, this is the first time we're doing something like this. However, we feel like we need to carry the messages of the IPCC outside of the exclusive halls where we have been debating them and making science accessible for everyone in order to understand and make your own picture of the events unfolding.
Thank you very much, Sven. Now, let's make the questions a bit more accessible. I'm going to come over here because I think we might have some questions. Yes.
Hi, I want to ask a question. What are the global consequences of species extinction?
Thank you. Global consequences of species extinction. I think Charlie's a good one for this.
So we depend on species in lots of ways. We depend on animals and plants because they undermine. They underpin our economies and they underpin our survival. So one of the most important groups that we hear a lot about recently is pollinators. We are suffering the extinction of pollinating invertebrates, and also not just the extinction of whole species, but the declines in abundance of common species. Pollinators are hugely important because a huge proportion of plants, including our food crops, are pollinated by animals. Think about species in the ocean. So over 1 billion people depend on fish and seafood as their primary source of protein. So that's one person in 7 on the planet depends on wild animals for protein. We also depend on species to minimize the impacts of the climate crisis. So of all our emissions, for example, 30% of all our emissions from fossil fuels are absorbed by ecosystems on land, principally forests. So if we don't have trees and plants to absorb these, they will, the climate crisis will be much, much worse. And we don't just need these forests and wetlands and other ecosystems to mitigate against the climate crisis being worse. We also need them to help us adapt, so to help us survive the impacts of climate change. So for example, we know that flooding is going to be worse with climate change. Well, forests reduce flooding, so do wetlands. We know that storms and major destructive weather events will be worse with climate change. Well, forests and other ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, also help protect us against those. So for all sorts of reasons, we depend on having functional ecosystems on the planet. They underpin our economies, they contribute to our survival, and yet we are destroying them at an incredibly rapid pace. Some of you might have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel, or in fact the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is like the IPCC but for wildlife. And earlier this year they published a report saying that 1 million species are threatened with extinction over the next few decades if we don't radically change the way we alter the way we interact with our planet. And this was the clearest warning we have had yet about the danger we are putting ourselves in. So personally, I'm interested in conserving species because I think they're beautiful. I think they're, wild animals and wild places are lovely, and I think we should protect them for, just because we should. But even if you're entirely 100% selfish and you're only concerned about human survival, then it's entirely necessary for that reason too.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, and I just think it's also important. So that last point you were making, I think, can be emphasised. Is like, if you just look up, and you look up and up and up and up, then you go about a kilometre or 2 kilometres up in the atmosphere. There's nothing alive up there. There's nothing alive in space. And if you look down, and you look down and down and down, a kilometre, again, there's nothing alive there. It's all dead. There's a small band in this whole universe that we know of around the crust of this planet that is alive, and it's a miracle. And we are now jeopardizing that. We're tearing it apart. This unique, special biosphere that supports us, that we are completely embedded in and rely on, and we are trampling over it. And so, I think, all our food comes from soil and farming, right? And all of that is dependent on there being functional ecosystems that allow for those lands to be productive. And that's driven by all the plants and microbes and fungi that are in those ecosystems. And so when we start causing all of these extinctions, then we put the very fundamental basis of our civilization, which is agriculture, at risk. And climate change is doing that as well. So there's these two converging crises, as Charlie was saying. And I think I just want to stress, everything is interconnected, right? That's the lesson of ecology, is that everything is interconnected with each other. And so you have the microbes, you have the fungi, you have the plants, and they're all interacting together, and that's what I was studying. And like I said, it's this Jenga tower effect, where if you start losing enough of those pieces, at some point, the system doesn't have any integrity, and it falls apart. And so the threat of losing all of these species is that we will reach these cascading tipping points which will cause the collapse of our ecosystems. Because all of the systems are built up from all of these parts working together.
So, and basically, within all of that nexus, only half a degree already makes a huge difference. We set ourselves as international community the goal of 2 degrees, but if we look at it from a species loss perspective, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees makes actually a big difference. 4% of all insects, 6% of all plants, and another 6% of all vertebrates will go extinct at 1.5 degrees. However, with 2 degrees, that number jumps to 14%, 16%, and 8% respectively. So only this little half a degree, which for us is not much, is actually having a catastrophic impact on ecosystems on all geographic locations.
I'd like to add one final thing before we close this part, is that people often say, well, here in the UK, it can't be that terrible because, surely in the Amazon and that's where it's all happening. But actually a State of Nature report that came out recently, 4 or 5 years ago, there was 1 in 5 British mammals that were at risk of extinction. 1 in 5 British mammals. Just this month, another report came out from the same people, just a few years later, it's now 1 in 4. That's how quickly things are moving here in the UK. And also talking about crops and talking about the damage to our crops, we've lost half of our topsoil. 95% of what we eat relies on good, healthy integrity of the soil. We've lost half of the topsoil internationally, globally. It takes 150 years to produce just 2.5 centimetres of topsoil. We've lost half of it. And the creatures that usually help to restore topsoil, anyone know? Earthworms. We've lost 80% of our earthworms due to the biodiversity crisis. And due to climate change, we're losing even more soil because of extreme weather events, also due to human use of land by agriculture. These crises are interlinked, they're all connected, and each one is going to make the next one worse. For every 1/10 of a degree we go up in temperature, for every extra ton of carbon dioxide we emit, which is happening every single day, we're going to hurtle closer and closer towards a point at which there's going to be massive crisis, and it's going to impact you and your children and everybody on this planet, in this country, very, very soon.
Okay, thank you very much for tuning into this live stream, Rebels.
Extinction
We have to take a break now. We may be switching this live stream to the action at Vauxhall Gardens, the Global Justice site in the UK Rebellion.
And including some of our most loved animals, things like
don't go away.
watervoles.
There'll be more action from Extinction Rebellion
that's a watervole.
coming up very
And
soon.
we're not
Thanks for
also
joining us,
talking just about things
scientists
that might happen in
for
the future,
Extinction Rebellion.
but about things that have already happened.